All right, so the question I got today was whether a startup founder should hire a development agency to build their product. This is actually a pretty complex question. Or one thing to note is that Y Combinator recommends against hiring development agencies, and there are lots of investors that also do that. We're gonna dive into why that is, but before that, let's explore some of the options that founders have when they're, or non-technical founders have when they're trying to build tech. We're probably gonna go from like worst to best, and probably the worst option that you can do, or the worst thing that you can do, is hire a bunch of interns to build your product. What ends up happening is that you end up building a product with a bunch of underqualified engineering students. Two things tend to happen. One is that they tend to go for like the latest and greatest in technology, which is not necessarily stable or production ready. So you might have, version 1 of your product in like the 6 months of an internship built in one tech stack, and then when they're back in school and the next batch of interns comes in, they're recommending scrapping the whole thing and building it in a new tech stack because they don't know or they don't understand the old one. This is a very, very common pattern that we've seen in the last couple of years. The other thing that happens is that it's very unlikely to get a production level app when you're hiring interns to build this, right? So computer science education does not make an engineer. You really need somebody who's had the experience of like building a product live, understanding what redundancies need to be there, understanding what happens if like there's a crash or if a service goes down. All of those things need to be considered when you're trying to build a production grade application. I don't recommend hiring interns. I think that's a very bad idea. The next bad option is a bunch of freelancers. What tends to happen again right after like the chaos created by interns is that founders tend to go to platforms like Upwork or Fiverr or any of these like freelancer.com, what have you, and try to find freelancers to execute on the product, right? On an hourly basis typically. What you need to understand is that you don't need just one engineer to build something, right? You'll need a product team. So you'll need somebody who understands design, you'll need somebody who understands user experience, you'll need somebody who understands the front end, the back end, the database, DevOps, etc. And often that, or like each of those skill sets require a separate individual. And when you're hiring freelancers, a couple of things tend to happen. One is that you might get stuck in a blame game type of situation where, the engineers that have no relationship with each other, or like the team members that have no relationship with each other, are basically blaming the other person for every crash or every mistake or every error or every delay. The other thing is that you as the founder are basically stuck playing project manager and like having to manage a bunch of different resources without necessarily speaking the same, technical language that they're speaking. And the third thing is that freelancers tend to be mercenaries, right? So they're committing a couple of hours per week for you, and somebody gives them a better offer, they will move on to that better offer. So it tends to be difficult for founders to build any kind of long-term team or solution when you're working with freelancers like this. It's a pretty bad idea to do this because of like the number of people that you require and how much coordination work and how much energy that takes. Now the next option, and these are pretty good options now. One of the most wonderful things that you can do is find a technical co-founder. However, that's easier said than done. As a software engineer, I get propositioned on almost a daily basis that, where somebody is asking me to become their non-technical co-founder for equity. It really, I would say that engineers are pretty jaded when it comes to these kinds of proposals, because the expectation seems to be that the engineer puts in all of the work, builds out all of the platform for a fraction of the ownership, whereas the founder is contributing, just the idea. That has been unfortunately the trend in the industry over the last couple of years, and so less and less engineers are willing to do that kind of deal, especially because they're getting like proposals on a daily basis and there are so many options available to them. And also think about it from, the perspective of that engineer, right? So if they're genuinely qualified, they probably have a full-time job somewhere. So you're essentially asking them to work their nights and their weekends for free to build you a product. It might take a full-time employee a month or 2 months to do. When somebody's working nights and weekends, it's gonna take maybe twice as long, maybe 3 times as long. And ultimately, it leads to burnout. So it's a really difficult thing to balance here. While having a technical co-founder is incredibly valuable, it is really difficult to get one, especially if you don't have a pedigree or if you don't have history of building successful startups. So where does that leave you, right? So the development agency is an interesting option, and we can talk about why some investors discourage it, right? To understand the reason they discourage it, you have to understand what makes SaaS companies win. The Y Combinator philosophy and the philosophy of a lot of early stage investors is that the most successful startups have the fastest build, measure, and learn loop. So the idea is that the more number of iterations you can do of build, measure, and learn, the more successful your company is going to be. And for that to happen as quickly as humanly possible, it is almost required that you have in-house technical talent, right? So you have a CTO or a couple of founding engineers that are working really as quickly as possible to push something out, get feedback, and then iterate and push like the next version out and the next version out and so on. And when it comes to the typical development agency, that's not how they work, right? So there are lots of reasons that dev agencies have a bad reputation. They split resources, into different projects. They're focused on inflating hours and maximizing billing rather than focusing on building a business. Every time you're asking for a change, there's more of a conversation about scoping and pricing and so on, right? So those are some of the challenges that you get with development agencies and why they are sometimes, or they can be detrimental to building a successful startups. That said, there are some agencies like Byldd, like a couple of others, that are focusing on helping non-technical domain expert founders build products. They're solving for these issues that are, common with other dev agencies of having that accelerated build, measure, learn cycle, having a dedicated product team that's accessible to the founder at all times, making sure that the team is dedicated and working exclusively on that project so that all the concentration is on that and they are proactively thinking of improvements and how to make that project better, right? The venture studio model is a very interesting model for non-technical founders to look into. The benefits of having a in-house technical co-founder with the benefits of having a development agency that can execute on your vision and help you build the successful business.